You've lied today. Perhaps you told someone they looked nice when you didn't really think so. Perhaps you said you were fine when you weren't. Perhaps you exaggerated a story to make it more interesting, or omitted a detail that would have made you look bad. Perhaps you lied to yourself about why you did something, constructing a flattering narrative that doesn't quite match reality. According to research conducted over decades, the average person lies between 1 and 2 times per day, and some studies suggest the number might be even higher. We lie to strangers, to friends, to family, to co-workers, and most insidiously, to ourselves. We lie about small things and large things, about matters of no consequence and about things that shape the course of our lives. And here's the paradox that makes lying such a fascinating subject for exploration. We almost universally condemn lying as morally wrong. We teach our children that lying is bad. We lose trust in people we discover have lied to us, and yet we all do it constantly throughout our lives. Welcome to this comprehensive exploration of one of humanity's most universal and most paradoxical behaviors. Over the next several hours, we're going to examine lying from every angle we can imagine. Evolutionary, neurological, psychological, philosophical, developmental, cultural, and personal. We'll look at why nature might have selected for the ability to deceive, what happens in our brains when we lie, how children develop the capacity for deception, the many different types of lies we tell, the particular puzzle of self-deception, the philosophical debates about whether lying can ever be justified, how different cultures view dishonesty, the social costs of widespread lying, and ultimately what it means to live in a world where deception is both condemned and inevitable. This is designed as both an intellectual journey and a companion for sleep. So if you find yourself drifting away at any point, that's exactly what should happen. There's no obligation to stay awake for every word. Let the ideas flow through your consciousness, and when sleep comes, welcome it. The paradoxes of human nature will still be here tomorrow. To understand why humans lie, we need to start not with humans, but with the broader animal kingdom, because deception is not unique to our species. The capacity for deceit appears to have emerged millions of years before humans evolved, and it exists across a remarkable range of creatures. Consider the killdeer, a common shorebird found throughout the Americas. When a predator approaches a killdeer nest containing eggs or chicks, the parent bird will move away from the nest and begin dragging one wing as if it's broken, limping and fluttering in a display of vulnerability. The predator, seeing what appears to be an easy meal, follows the apparently injured bird. The killdeer leads the predator away from the nest, and once a safe distance has been achieved, suddenly recovers and flies away, leaving the confused predator far from the actual location of the vulnerable young. This is deception, a deliberate signal designed to create a false belief in another creature's mind. Consider the cuckoo bird, which has evolved an elaborate strategy of brood parasitism. Female cuckoos lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species, and the cuckoo egg often mimics the appearance of the host species' eggs in remarkable detail. When the cuckoo chick hatches, often before the host's own eggs, it pushes the host's eggs out of the nest. The host parents, deceived by the imposter in their nest, raise the cuckoo chick as their own, despite the fact that it often grows much larger than they are, sometimes comically so. This is deception encoded in biology, refined by millions of years of evolution because it provides a reproductive advantage. The cuckoos who were better at deceiving host parents produced more offspring, and gradually the entire species became masters of this particular form of dishonesty. Among primates, our closest relatives, deception becomes more sophisticated and intentional. The primatologist Richard Byrne, who spent years studying baboons in Africa, documented numerous instances of what he called tactical deception. In one famous example, a young baboon named Paul watched an adult dig up and begin eating a nutritious root. Paul looked around, then suddenly gave an alarm call, the signal that a predator had been spotted. The troop, including the adult with the root, scattered to safety. But there was no predator. Paul had lied, and once the others were gone, Paul returned to where the root had been dropped and ate it himself. This wasn't instinct or pre-programmed behavior, but rather a calculated deception, requiring Paul to understand that he could create a false belief in others and exploit that false belief for his own benefit. Chimpanzees, who share approximately 98.8% of their DNA with humans, display even more sophisticated deception. Researchers have observed chimps deliberately concealing food from other chimps, waiting until they're unobserved to retrieve hidden treats, and even leading rivals away from food locations through misdirection. In one study, a chimp named Belle learned where food was hidden, but was always prevented from retrieving it, because a dominant chimp named Rock would follow her and take whatever she found. Belle developed a strategy. She would sit on the food's location, waiting until Rock lost interest and moved away, then quickly retrieve it when he wasn't watching. When Rock caught on to this strategy and started watching more carefully, Belle began walking to incorrect locations first, checking to see if Rock followed, essentially running counter-surveillance before going to the actual food location. This is deception that requires understanding another individual's knowledge state and intentionally manipulating it, which requires sophisticated cognitive abilities. There's even evidence of deception in great apes when interacting with humans. Coco, the famous gorilla who learned American Sign Language, was once caught red-handed having torn a sink off the wall in her enclosure. When asked what happened, Coco signed, "Cat did it," blaming the incident on her pet kitten. This suggests not just the ability to lie, but the understanding that lies can deflect blame, a level of social cognitive sophistication that's quite remarkable. What all these examples demonstrate is that deception is not a moral failing unique to humans, but rather an adaptive strategy that evolution has favored across many species. The ability to deceive others provides competitive advantages: access to food and resources, protection of offspring, avoidance of conflict, and in social species, navigation of complex hierarchies. But humans have taken deception to levels that no other species approaches, and the reason is language. Other animals can deceive through action, through false signals, through concealment. But humans can deceive through abstract communication, through statements about things that are not present, through narratives about the past and promises about the future, through complex justifications and elaborate rationalizations. Language allows us to create entire fictional realities in other people's minds. We can lie about our intentions, our feelings, our beliefs, our histories. We can construct false identities, fabricate entire biographies, create conspiracy theories and propaganda and disinformation campaigns that reshape how millions of people understand reality. The evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, in his groundbreaking work on the evolution of deception, made a fascinating and somewhat disturbing observation. Self-deception may have evolved specifically to facilitate deceiving others. Trivers argued that conscious deception has a problem. It's cognitively demanding and often produces behavioral tells. When we know we're lying, we have to suppress the truth while constructing and presenting the falsehood. And this cognitive load often manifests in physiological signals, micro-expressions, vocal stress, hesitations, all the subtle cues that experienced interrogators and lie detector machines try to pick up on. But if we can deceive ourselves, if we can actually believe our own lies, then we can present those lies with complete conviction, with none of the telltale signs of conscious deception. As Trivers put it in one memorably cynical formulation, we deceive ourselves the better to deceive others. This has profound implications for understanding human behavior, because it suggests that much of our conscious experience, our sense of our own motivations and beliefs, might be a kind of public relations department, a narrative constructed not for accuracy but for social presentation. The evolutionary advantages of lying are clear enough, but lying also carries significant risks and costs. If you're caught lying, you face social punishment, loss of reputation, damaged relationships, and in many societies throughout history, legal or even violent consequences. So why hasn't evolution selected for completely honest creatures? The answer seems to be that lying works often enough and provides sufficient benefits when it does work to remain in the behavioral repertoire. In evolutionary game theory terms, a population of all honest individuals would be vulnerable to exploitation by even a small number of liars, so honesty can't be evolutionarily stable on its own. But a population of all liars can't cooperate effectively, so complete dishonesty isn't stable either. The result is an evolutionary equilibrium where most individuals are mostly honest most of the time, but everyone retains the capacity for strategic deception and deploys it when the benefits seem likely to outweigh the risks. We are, in the words of one researcher, conditionally honest, honest by default, but capable of dishonesty when circumstances demand or allow it. There's also a fascinating correlation in primates between brain size, specifically the size of the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, and the frequency and sophistication of deceptive behavior. Species with larger neocortex ratios engage in more tactical deception, suggesting that intelligence and dishonesty are linked, that the cognitive capacities that allow for advanced social reasoning, theory of mind, and strategic thinking are the same capacities that enable sophisticated lying. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge but appears to be true. Lying is not a glitch in human cognition, but rather a feature, an application of some of our most advanced mental abilities. The same faculties that allow us to write novels, conduct diplomacy, and teach complex skills are the faculties that allow us to construct and maintain elaborate deceptions. When we lie, specific regions of our brain become more active than when we tell the truth. And understanding this neuroscience provides insight into why lying feels different from honest communication and why some people become better liars than others. Functional MRI studies have consistently shown that lying requires more cognitive effort than truth-telling. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain involved in executive function, decision-making, and impulse control, shows significantly increased activity during deception. This makes sense when you consider what lying requires. You must first activate the truthful response, then inhibit it, then construct a plausible alternative, then present that alternative while monitoring the listener's response for signs of skepticism or disbelief, all while maintaining a memory of what you've said, so you can keep your story consistent if questioned further. Truth-telling is simpler. You just report what actually happened, or what you actually think or feel. There's no suppression, no construction, less monitoring required. The amygdala, a brain region centrally involved in fear and emotional responses, also shows activation during lying, particularly when the stakes are high or when there's significant risk of being caught. This is the source of the anxiety many people feel when lying, the physiological stress response that polygraph machines attempt to measure. Your heart rate may increase, you may perspire more, your voice may become slightly higher pitched, all because your amygdala is signaling danger. The anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in error detection and conflict monitoring, becomes active as well, essentially registering the conflict between what you know to be true and what you're saying. The insula, associated with emotional awareness and interoception, the sense of your own body's internal state, may activate as you experience guilt, anxiety, or moral discomfort about lying. What's particularly interesting from a neuroscience perspective is that repeated lying appears to change these activation patterns. There's a phenomenon called habituation, where responses to a repeated stimulus decrease over time. When people lie repeatedly, the emotional responses, the activation in the amygdala and insula, the feelings of anxiety and guilt, these tend to diminish. The first time someone tells a significant lie, it may be quite stressful, activating robust fear and conflict responses. But the 10th time, the 100th time, the emotional component is reduced. This is neuroplasticity in action. The brain adapts to the behavior that's being repeated. This has concerning implications because it suggests that ethical constraints on lying may be partially dependent on emotional responses, on feelings of guilt and anxiety that serve as internal deterrents. And these deterrents can be worn down through practice. Pathological liars, people who lie frequently and compulsively, show different baseline activation patterns in these regions, suggesting their brains have adapted to deception as a default mode. Research using transcranial magnetic stimulation, a technique that can temporarily disrupt activity in specific brain regions, has shown that interfering with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity makes people more likely to lie when there's potential personal benefit, suggesting this region is involved in exerting self-control against dishonest impulses. Similarly, studies have found that cognitive load, anything that makes thinking harder, like time pressure or having to remember a long number, increases the likelihood of lying because the effortful process of honesty becomes harder to maintain when cognitive resources are depleted. This has practical implications. People are more likely to lie when they're tired, stressed, distracted, or cognitively overloaded, which is why interrogators often employ techniques that induce fatigue and confusion. The cognitive burden of lying extends beyond the moment of deception. Maintaining lies over time requires keeping track of what you've said to whom, remembering the details of your false narrative, being alert to situations where the truth might be revealed, and potentially constructing additional lies to support the original deception. This is why elaborate lies and long-term deceptions are so cognitively taxing, and why people often feel relieved when they can finally tell the truth. The truth has the virtue of being easy to remember, because it actually happened. Lies require active maintenance, and the more elaborate the deception, the greater the cognitive overhead. This is why inconsistencies often emerge in false stories over time, why details shift with retelling, why interrogators use repeated questioning to try to catch liars in contradictions. Understanding when and how children develop the capacity to lie provides crucial insights into what lying reveals about human cognitive development and what enables our species to be such sophisticated deceivers. Deception begins remarkably early in human development. Infants as young as 6 months will engage in what researchers call proto-deception. Behaviors like fake crying or fake laughing designed to manipulate adult responses. A baby who has learned that crying brings attention may produce crying sounds when they want attention, even when nothing is actually wrong, even when they're not distressed. This is the beginning of instrumental deception, using false signals to achieve desired outcomes. Similarly, babies will often produce exaggerated laughter in response to games or interactions that they're not actually finding that funny, because they've learned that laughing encourages adults to continue the interaction. Around age 2 or 3, children begin producing their first clearly deliberate verbal lies. These early lies are quite transparent, and adults can usually see through them easily, but they represent a significant cognitive milestone. The child has understood that they can say something that's not true, and that the listener doesn't automatically know it's not true. This requires what philosophers and psychologists call theory of mind, the understanding that other people have minds with their own beliefs and knowledge states, and that these mental states can differ from one's own. A very young child operates on a kind of assumed transparency, as if whatever they know, everyone knows. But around age 4 or 5, children develop a more sophisticated theory of mind and understand that others' knowledge is limited to what they've experienced or been told. This is absolutely crucial for sophisticated lying, because you have to understand what the other person knows and doesn't know in order to construct a lie they'll believe. The classic experimental demonstration of theory of mind is the false belief task. A child watches a puppet show where Sally places a marble in a basket and leaves the room. While Sally is gone, another character, Anne, moves the marble from the basket to a box. The child is then asked, when Sally returns, where will she look for the marble? Children younger than about 4 will typically say Sally will look in the box, because that's where the marble actually is. They haven't yet grasped that Sally has a false belief, that Sally's knowledge state differs from reality and from what the child knows. But children over 4 or 5 will correctly answer that Sally will look in the basket, because they understand that Sally doesn't know the marble was moved, that Sally has a belief that differs from reality. This is the same cognitive capacity that enables lying. Understanding that you can create false beliefs in others by providing false information. By age 5 or 6, most children can lie convincingly to adults about simple matters, though their lies are still often undermined by behavioral tells, by emotional responses, by limited ability to maintain consistency under questioning. As children develop through elementary school years, their lies become more sophisticated, better planned, more emotionally controlled. There's also an important developmental shift in the types of lies children tell. Very young children lie primarily for self-protective reasons, to avoid punishment or to obtain something they want. These are antisocial lies motivated purely by self-interest. But as children develop socially and emotionally, they begin to understand and produce prosocial lies, lies told to benefit others or to maintain social harmony. The classic example is thanking someone for a gift you don't like, or telling someone they did well when they didn't. These pro-social lies require not just theory of mind, but also empathy, an understanding of and concern for others' feelings. Interestingly, there's a cultural mythology in many Western societies that children are naturally honest, and that lying is something they learn from corrupt adults. The story of George Washington and the cherry tree, where young George supposedly confessed to cutting down his father's cherry tree, saying, "I cannot tell a lie," is entirely fictional, fabricated by a biographer after Washington's death. Yet, this story has been repeated for generations as a moral lesson, revealing a deep cultural ambivalence about lying. We want to believe children are innocent truth-tellers, even though the developmental evidence shows clearly that children begin lying as soon as they're cognitively capable of it. The story's persistence also reveals something else. We tell lies about lying itself. We mythologize honesty because we're uncomfortable with the reality that deception is part of normal human development. Research has shown that children who develop the ability to lie earlier tend to score higher on measures of executive function, the cognitive abilities involved in planning, impulse control, and complex thinking. In other words, lying ability is positively correlated with intelligence in children. This creates a strange paradox for parents and educators. When your child successfully lies to you, it's actually a sign of cognitive development, a demonstration of sophisticated mental abilities. Obviously, this doesn't mean lying should be encouraged, but it does complicate the simple moral story we often tell about lying being a sign of deficiency or failure. The child who can lie effectively has achieved important developmental milestones, mastered theory of mind, learned to control their emotional expressions and behavioral tells, developed the executive function to plan and execute complex cognitive tasks. These are the same abilities that will serve them well in countless legitimate pursuits. The capacity for deception, in this light, is inseparable from the capacity for many forms of social and intellectual achievement. Not all lies are created equal, and one of the challenges in discussing lying is that the English word lie covers an enormous range of behaviors with very different motivations, social functions, and moral implications. Understanding these different types of lies helps clarify why lying is so common, despite being universally condemned in the abstract. Let's start with what are called white lies, or pro-social lies, falsehoods told to protect someone's feelings or to maintain social harmony. When someone asks, "How do I look?" and you respond, "You look great," even though you think the outfit is unflattering, that's a white lie. When you taste a meal someone cooked for you that you don't particularly enjoy and you say, "This is delicious," that's a white lie. When someone tells you about their accomplishment and you express enthusiasm you don't quite feel, that's a white lie. These lies serve an important social function. They maintain smooth social interactions. They prevent hurt feelings. They demonstrate care for others' emotional well-being, even at the expense of strict truthfulness. Pro-social lies are so common and so socially accepted that most people don't feel guilty about them and don't feel they've really lied at all. Research shows that when people are asked to count the number of lies they've told in a day, many don't count white lies, suggesting these are in a different mental category than what they consider real lying. And from an evolutionary perspective, Pro-social lies make sense as a behavior that promotes group cohesion and cooperation. Small groups of early humans couldn't afford constant conflict arising from brutal honesty about everyone's shortcomings and failures. Some degree of tact, of face-saving, of allowing people to maintain dignity even when they've made mistakes. This probably contributed to group stability and thereby to survival. In many collectivist cultures, particularly in East Asia, pro-social lies are not just accepted, but expected, considered part of proper social behavior. The concept of face, maintaining your own dignity and protecting others' dignity, takes precedence over strict factual accuracy in many social contexts. Self-protective lies are probably the most common type. The lies we tell to avoid punishment, embarrassment, or negative consequences for ourselves. These emerge earliest in child development and remain frequent throughout life. When someone asks, "Did you finish that report?" and you say yes when you haven't, that's self-protective lying. When you're pulled over by police and asked if you know how fast you were going and you say, "No, officer," hoping to avoid a ticket, that's self-protective lying. These lies are condemned more than white lies because they're selfish rather than pro-social. But they're also understandable from an evolutionary perspective. An organism that can successfully deceive threats faces fewer costs than an organism that can't. The child who can convince parents they didn't break the vase avoids punishment. The employee who can blame a mistake on circumstances rather than their own negligence keeps their job. These lies often feel necessary, even if we're ashamed of them afterward. Lies of omission occupy an interesting gray area. These are situations where you don't speak an untruth, but you withhold relevant true information, allowing someone to maintain a false belief or to form an incorrect conclusion. If your partner asks, "Did anything interesting happen today?" and you don't mention that you ran into your ex and had coffee with them, that's a lie of omission. Many people don't feel these are real lies because no false statement was made, but they achieve the same outcome as active lies. They manipulate someone else's knowledge state for your benefit. The common protest, "I didn't lie, I just didn't mention it," reveals the moral ambiguity here. Legally and ethically, lies of omission can be as serious as active lies in certain contexts. If you're selling a house and you know there's foundation damage, but you don't volunteer that information, you're liable, even though you didn't make a false statement. The buyer could reasonably expect relevant information to be disclosed. Exaggeration is extremely common and often not thought of as lying at all. But it is a form of deception. When you tell a story and inflate the numbers, there must have been hundreds of people there when there were maybe 50. You're exaggerating. When you describe how long you worked on something, "I spent all day on this," when it was really a couple hours, you're exaggerating. Exaggeration serves several functions. It makes stories more interesting. It emphasizes your emotional experience even if it distorts facts. It can enhance your status by making your accomplishments seem greater, or your challenges seem larger. Research by Francesca Gino and others has shown an interesting connection between dishonesty and creativity. More creative people tend to be more likely to exaggerate and to bend truth in other ways. This may be because the same cognitive flexibility that enables creative thinking, the ability to see things in novel ways, to generate unusual associations, also makes it easier to generate plausible alternative versions of events that serve your interests. Pathological lying is qualitatively different from strategic lying. Pathological liars, people who lie compulsively and frequently, even when there's no clear benefit, and even when the lies can be easily disproved, seem to have a different relationship with truth than most people. Some pathological liars appear to have difficulty distinguishing their fantasies from reality, suggesting issues with reality testing and memory. Others seem to lie for the sake of lying, deriving some satisfaction from the act of deception itself rather than from its instrumental benefits. Pathological lying is sometimes associated with certain personality disorders, particularly narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, and may involve differences in brain structure and function. But it's important to distinguish pathological lying from strategic lying that becomes very frequent due to circumstances. Someone in an abusive relationship might lie constantly to their abuser to prevent violence, and while the frequency is similar to pathological lying, the motivation and psychological dynamic are completely different. Perhaps the most philosophically interesting and psychologically complex type of lying is self-deception, the lies we tell ourselves. Self-deception is paradoxical because it seems to require that we simultaneously believe something and don't believe it, that we know the truth and manage to avoid knowing it. How is this possible? One answer comes from evolutionary psychology and the work of researchers like William von Hippel. Von Hippel argues that self-deception evolved specifically to make us better at deceiving others. The logic is elegant and disturbing. If you consciously know you're lying to someone, you face several problems. First, lying is cognitively demanding, requiring you to suppress the truth while constructing and presenting falsehood. Second, conscious deception often produces telltale behavioral signals, micro-expressions, vocal stress, hesitations that experienced observers can detect. Third, if you're caught in a conscious lie, the punishment may be severe because you clearly intended to deceive. But if you can deceive yourself, if you can actually come to believe your own lies, you eliminate all three problems. You can present falsehood with the confidence and emotional authenticity of truth. You avoid the cognitive burden of maintaining conscious deception. And if caught, you can honestly claim you believed what you were saying, potentially reducing punishment because you lacked intent to deceive. Von Hippel identifies three major forms of self-deception that appear to be evolutionarily adaptive. The first is self-enhancement bias, the tendency to overestimate our own abilities, qualities, and prospects. Study after study shows that the vast majority of people rate themselves as above average on almost any desirable trait: intelligence, attractiveness, driving ability, ethical behavior, likelihood of success. Statistically, this is impossible. We can't all be above average, but this widespread self-enhancement serves a function. Overconfident people take more risks, pursue more opportunities, present themselves more assertively, and these behaviors often lead to success, even if the underlying self-assessment was inaccurate. There are costs too. Stock market losses from overconfident investors, plane crashes from overconfident pilots, wars from overconfident leaders. But on average, in the environments where humans evolved, moderate overconfidence about one's abilities appears to have been advantageous. The second form is memory reconstruction. the way we systematically edit our personal histories to paint ourselves in a more favorable light. Human memory is not a recording device that faithfully stores and retrieves experiences. It's a reconstructive process. And each time we remember something, we subtly alter it, often in ways that make us look better, that justify our past decisions, that erase or minimize our mistakes and emphasize our successes. Research shows that people remember their past selves as less competent and less mature than their present selves, a pattern that allows us to feel that we're constantly improving even if we're not. We remember voting for winning candidates more often than we actually did. We remember our exam scores as higher than they were. We remember predicting outcomes that we didn't actually predict. A phenomenon called hindsight bias. I knew it all along. These memory distortions aren't usually conscious. We genuinely believe our reconstructed memories are accurate, and they serve a function. They protect our self-esteem and allow us to maintain positive self-narratives. The third form of self-deception that von Hippel discusses is rationalization, the process of constructing justifications for decisions and behaviors after the fact. When we make decisions, we're often influenced by factors we don't consciously recognize: emotions, intuitions, social pressures, unconscious biases. But we're generally unaware of these influences. Instead, our conscious minds construct rational-sounding explanations for why we did what we did. This has been demonstrated dramatically in split-brain patients, people who have had the connection between their brain hemispheres surgically severed to treat epilepsy. Researchers can present information to just the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body but doesn't control language. The patient might be shown a command walk to just the right hemisphere. The patient gets up and starts walking. When asked why they're walking, they can't say because you showed me a command to walk, because their language-producing left hemisphere didn't see the command. Instead, they confabulate, I wanted to get a drink, or I needed to stretch. The left hemisphere, seeing the behavior, immediately constructs a plausible explanation, even though it has no actual knowledge of the cause. This interpreter function, as it's called, appears to operate in all of us all the time, constructing narratives about our motivations and decisions that feel true but may be largely fictional. These self-deceptions can have serious consequences. Overconfidence leads to unnecessary risks and failures. False memories can lead to false accusations and distorted personal histories. Rationalization allows us to maintain comfortable self-images while behaving in ways that contradict our stated values. But self-deception also provides psychological benefits. Research by Roy Baumeister and others suggests that certain positive illusions about ourselves and our circumstances may be necessary for mental health. There's a phenomenon called depressive realism, where people experiencing depression actually see themselves and the world more accurately than non-depressed people. Non-depressed people overestimate their control over events, their positive qualities, and their probable future outcomes. Depressed people assess these things more accurately, but accuracy comes at the cost of well-being. The positive illusions that psychologically healthy people maintain, while technically inaccurate, promote optimism, motivation, and resilience. One of the most powerful forms of self-deception is selective exposure to information, the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, and to avoid information that might challenge our existing views. This has become dramatically more visible in the age of the internet and social media, where algorithms curate our information diet based on our past behavior, creating filter bubbles and echo chambers. But selective exposure is not new and doesn't require algorithms. Research has shown that when given free choice of news sources, liberals disproportionately consume liberal media and conservatives disproportionately consume conservative media. People selectively remember facts that support their preferred political candidates and selectively forget facts that don't. When presented with scientific evidence about politically charged topics like climate change or vaccine safety, people's acceptance of the evidence is strongly predicted by whether it aligns with their political identity, even controlling for scientific literacy and reasoning ability. This is confirmation bias in action. We notice, seek out, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. We're not consciously aware we're doing this. We think we're objectively evaluating information, but we're actually processing it through filters that preserve our existing worldview. And this makes sense evolutionarily. Changing your beliefs is cognitively costly and socially risky. Beliefs are often tied to group identity, to social relationships, to life decisions you've already made. Maintaining consistent beliefs, even in the face of contradictory evidence, provides stability and cohesion. The person who constantly revises their worldview based on new information might be more accurate but also more isolated, less committed to their community, less attractive as an ally. So we evolved to be somewhat resistant to belief change, to be skilled at dismissing or reinterpreting evidence that threatens our existing models of reality. The Dunning-Kruger effect represents another form of self-deception about our own competence. Research by David Dunning and Justin Kruger showed that people who perform poorly on tests of logical reasoning, grammar, or humor not only do poorly but also dramatically overestimate their performance. People in the bottom quartile typically think they're in the top half. This is not mere modesty lacking in low performers. It's a specific pattern where the least competent are most confident. The reason appears to be that the skills needed to perform well in a domain are the same skills needed to evaluate performance in that domain. If you lack logical reasoning skills, you can't accurately assess your logical reasoning ability. You don't know what you don't know. Conversely, highly competent people often suffer from imposter syndrome, underestimating their abilities because they can see all the nuances they haven't mastered and assume everyone else has mastered them. The result is a world where the incompetent are confidently wrong, and the competent are hesitantly right, creating conditions for poor decision-making at individual and institutional levels. All these forms of self-deception raise profound questions about self-knowledge and agency. If we're systematically deceived about our own motivations, abilities, and memories, in what sense do we know ourselves? And if our decisions are based on self-deceptions, in what sense are they free? Philosophy has long grappled with the problem of self-knowledge, but modern psychology suggests the problem is even more severe than ancient philosophers imagined. We're not just occasionally mistaken about ourselves. We're systematically, adaptively, evolutionarily designed to be mistaken about ourselves in ways that promote reproductive success over accuracy. This is deeply uncomfortable for anyone committed to rationality, to self-improvement, to making ethical choices based on honest self-assessment. It suggests that the unexamined life in Socrates' famous formulation, is not just unworthwhile, but actually unavoidable, because much of what would need to be examined is hidden from examination by the architecture of our own minds. The philosophical debate about whether lying is ever justified has occupied ethicists for millennia, and examining these debates reveals not just abstract argument, but fundamentally different ways of thinking about morality, agency, and how we ought to live. Let's start with the most uncompromising position, that of Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German philosopher who argued that lying is always, without exception, morally wrong. Kant's argument stems from his categorical imperative, a principle he believed should guide all moral reasoning. In one formulation, the categorical imperative states, "Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." In simpler terms, only do things that you could consistently want everyone to do in similar circumstances. Apply this to lying. If everyone lied whenever it benefited them to lie, language itself would become meaningless. The institution of truth-telling, the assumption that people generally mean what they say, would collapse. Promises would be worthless. Testimony would be useless. Social cooperation would become impossible. Therefore, Kant argued, lying is inherently self-contradictory as a universal principle. You're using the institution of truth-telling to deceive, essentially free-riding on others' honesty. Moreover, Kant argued that lying violates another formulation of his categorical imperative. Treat people always as ends in themselves, never merely as means. When you lie to someone, you're treating them as a mere means to your ends. You're manipulating them, using their rational agency against them, denying them the information they would need to make free, informed choices. You're essentially treating them as a tool rather than as a rational agent deserving of respect. For Kant, these arguments led to an absolute prohibition on lying. No exceptions. No circumstances that would justify lying. Truth-telling is a perfect duty, one that admits of no exceptions. The most famous challenge to Kant's position comes from a thought experiment proposed by the French philosopher Benjamin Constant. Imagine that a murderer comes to your door asking for the location of someone they intend to kill. You know where that person is. The murderer asks you directly, "Is so-and-so hiding in your house?" What should you do? Common moral intuition says you should absolutely lie to the murderer to protect the potential victim. But Kant, remarkably, insisted that you should tell the truth. You're not responsible for what the murderer does with that truth. You're only responsible for your own adherence to moral law, which categorically prohibits lying. Kant argued that you can refuse to answer, or you can evade the question, but you cannot lie. To most people, this seems obviously wrong, even monstrous. It suggests that Kant's absolute rule against lying leads to absurd and morally abhorrent conclusions when applied to real situations. Utilitarian philosophers, following Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, offer a very different framework for thinking about lying. Utilitarianism judges actions by their consequences, specifically by whether they produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people or minimize suffering. In this framework, lying is not inherently wrong. It's wrong when it produces worse outcomes than truth-telling, and permissible or even obligatory when it produces better outcomes The white lies we discussed earlier are easily justified on utilitarian grounds. A small deception that prevents hurt feelings produces more overall happiness than brutal honesty would. Lying to the murderer at the door is obviously justified because saving a life matters more than the principle of truth-telling. Professional contexts where deception might be warranted, like undercover police work or military intelligence, can be justified if they produce better outcomes than alternatives. But utilitarianism faces its own challenges when applied to lying. First, consequences are often uncertain and difficult to predict. When you lie, you might think you're producing good outcomes, but you could be wrong about the consequences. The person you lied to might discover the truth, and the damage to trust might outweigh whatever benefit you thought you were producing. Second, utilitarianism can justify lies that seem intuitively wrong. If lying to a dying person about their prognosis produces more happiness in their final days, utilitarianism seems to endorse it. But many people feel uncomfortable with such paternalistic deception. Third, widespread utilitarian lying might undermine the general institution of truth-telling, producing negative consequences that offset the benefits of individual lies. If everyone lies whenever they calculate, it will produce slightly better outcomes. Trust might deteriorate society-wide, creating worse outcomes. Overall, virtue ethics, associated with Aristotle and more recent philosophers like Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse, offers a third approach. Virtue ethics focuses not on duties or consequences, but on character, on what kind of person you're becoming through your choices. A virtuous person, in this framework, is honest. Not because honesty is an absolute rule, but because honesty is characteristic of a good person, of someone with integrity. But virtue ethics also recognizes that wisdom is a virtue, and wisdom sometimes involves knowing when to make exceptions to general rules. An honest person doesn't lie casually or for trivial personal benefit, but an honest person might lie in extraordinary circumstances where not lying would be foolish or cruel. The virtue ethicist would likely lie to the murderer at the door, not because of calculated consequences, but because an honest person would recognize that this is not a situation where honesty is appropriate, that protecting the innocent takes precedence. Modern applied ethics continues to grapple with these questions in specific professional and personal contexts. Medical ethics extensively debates what doctors should tell patients. Should you always tell a cancer patient their prognosis, even if you believe the knowledge will destroy their hope and quality of life in their remaining time? If a patient asks their family, "Did I suffer after a trauma they don't remember?" should the family give an accurate description of the suffering, or should they minimize it to spare the patient anguish? Professional codes generally lean toward truth-telling, citing patient autonomy and informed consent, but individual practitioners often deviate from this in practice, exercising what they consider compassionate judgment about when full disclosure serves the patient and when it doesn't. Similar debates occur around dementia care. Is it ethical to lie to dementia patients to prevent distress? To play along with false beliefs about their deceased spouses being alive, or their long-past occupations still being current? Some argue this is compassionate care that respects their subjective reality. Others argue it's paternalistic and disrespectful, denying them truth, even if they can't fully process it. There's also the interesting category of therapeutic lying in scenarios like placebo treatments, where the effectiveness of the intervention depends on the patient not knowing it's a placebo. This creates a strange situation where honesty would undermine healing, where deception serves the patient's medical interests. Most modern medical practice handles this through vague truth-telling, explaining that this treatment has been effective for people with your condition, without specifying whether it's a placebo, allowing benefit without explicit lying. Moving beyond philosophical debate into empirical observation, it becomes clear that attitudes toward lying vary significantly across cultures, and understanding these variations reveals that what counts as acceptable deception is at least partially culturally constructed, rather than universal. The broad pattern suggested by cross-cultural research is that individualist cultures, particularly those rooted in Western European traditions, tend to place higher value on honesty as an expression of authentic individual identity, while collectivist cultures, particularly those in East Asia, place higher value on social harmony and may view certain kinds of deception as acceptable or even obligatory if they serve group cohesion. This is, of course, an oversimplification, and there's enormous variation within cultures, but the general pattern appears robust across multiple studies. In many East Asian cultures, the concept of face, maintaining dignity and social standing, is central to social interaction. Protecting someone's face, helping them avoid embarrassment or shame, is considered more important in many situations than providing strictly accurate information. If someone asks a question where an honest answer would be embarrassing or would create social conflict, the polite response is often an evasive or even false answer that preserves harmony. This isn't viewed as lying in the negative sense, but as skillful social navigation. Similarly, in many collectivist cultures, loyalty to family or in-group takes clear precedence over abstract principles of honesty. Lying to protect family members from external authorities, or lying to benefit your group, may be viewed not just as acceptable, but as obligatory. The person who prioritizes honesty with outsiders over loyalty to family might be seen not as virtuous, but as betraying fundamental social bonds. Honor cultures, found in many Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Latin American societies, place enormous emphasis on reputation, particularly family honor. In these contexts, lying about certain matters, particularly those involving family honor, sexual conduct, or challenges to status, may be especially serious because the lie compounds the dishonor. But lying about other matters may be more accepted if it's done skillfully and serves social functions. The emphasis on honor also means that being caught in a lie, being publicly exposed as dishonest, carries especially severe consequences because it demonstrates not just dishonesty, but failure to maintain face and status. Different religious traditions also have nuanced views on lying that complicate simple condemnation. While most major religions include prohibitions against lying in their core ethical teachings, many also recognize exceptions or qualifications. Judaism has a concept sometimes translated as peace lies, falsehoods told to maintain peace and harmony. The Talmud suggests that one may lie to protect someone from embarrassment, to preserve marital harmony, or to maintain modesty about one's own achievements. Islamic jurisprudence includes the concept of taqiyya, permission to lie about one's faith when under persecution or threat. This developed historically in contexts where religious minorities faced violence for their beliefs, and the scholarly consensus was that preserving life took precedence over openly declaring faith. Christianity has seen extensive debate about whether lying is ever permissible. with some theologians taking Augustinian hardline positions that lying is always sinful, while others recognize exceptions for protecting life or for circumstances where truth-telling would lead to grave injustice. Modern workplace culture, particularly in corporate environments, has developed norms around acceptable deception that many participants don't even consciously recognize as deception. The job interview is a ritualized performance where both parties know that the candidate is presenting an idealized version of themselves and that the employer is presenting an idealized version of the workplace, and both parties accept this as the expected form of the interaction. Resume inflation, presenting experiences in the most positive light, using euphemisms for failures or gaps in employment. This is so normalized that people who don't engage in it are at a disadvantage. Fake it till you make it is presented as career advice, essentially encouragement to deceive about your current competence while working to develop that competence. Corporate communication is filled with euphemisms and misdirection. Layoffs are right-sizing. Failures are learning opportunities. Disasters are challenges. This isn't seen as lying, but as professional discourse, yet it clearly involves systematic departure from straightforward truth-telling. Political lying has likely always existed, but there's extensive debate about whether it's become more prevalent and shameless in recent decades, or whether we're simply more aware of it due to fact-checking and instant communication. What's clear is that public tolerance for being lied to by politicians varies by culture and era. Some societies seem to expect and accept that politicians will make promises they can't or won't keep, engage in strategic ambiguity, and generally prioritize political advantage over strict accuracy. Other societies maintain higher expectations and punish exposed lies more severely through the political process. Social media has created new challenges. False information spreads faster than corrections. Algorithms amplify engagement over accuracy, and the sheer volume of information makes systematic fact-checking difficult. We may be entering an era where the concept of shared factual reality is breaking down, where different groups inhabit different information ecosystems with incompatible understandings of basic facts, making democratic deliberation increasingly impossible. Despite lying's ubiquity and the various ways it can be rationalized or culturally accepted, it carries significant costs at individual, relational, and societal levels. Understanding these costs helps explain why most philosophical and religious traditions condemn lying even while acknowledging its universal. At the most personal level, lying creates cognitive burden. As we discussed earlier in the neuroscience section, lying requires more mental effort than truth-telling. You must generate the falsehood, suppress the truth, monitor the listener for skepticism, remember what you said for consistency, manage anxiety about being caught. This cognitive load has measurable effects. Studies have shown that people instructed to lie show impaired performance on simultaneous cognitive tasks, suggesting that lying consumes mental resources that would otherwise be available for other processing. Over time, maintaining elaborate deceptions becomes psychologically exhausting. There are also physiological costs to lying. The stress response activated by deception, the elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol. These take a toll on the body when experienced chronically. Some research suggests that habitual liars may experience more stress-related health problems, though this is complicated by confounding factors. There's certainly a subjective experience reported by many people that living a lie Maintaining a false persona or hiding significant truths creates a constant background anxiety, a vigilance about being discovered that never fully quiets. This is distinct from the relatively minor discomfort of small social lies, which most people report feeling little to no distress about. But significant deceptions, lies about major life facts, identities, or behaviors, these often exact a psychological price, even when they're never discovered. At the relational level, the costs of lying are even more severe. Trust is the foundation of all meaningful human relationships, whether romantic partnerships, friendships, family bonds, or professional collaborations. Trust allows people to be vulnerable with each other, to make commitments and rely on each other, to cooperate on shared goals. Lying destroys trust, and once trust is broken, it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Research on romantic relationships shows that discovered infidelity, which almost always involves extensive lying, is one of the most damaging events a relationship can experience. Many relationships don't survive it, and even those that do often carry scar tissue, persistent doubt and monitoring that never fully resolves. Interestingly, sociologist Philip Blumstein's research suggested that marriage itself may create conditions that promote deception. Spouses lie to each other about money, about their pasts, about current attractions to others, about their feelings, often believing these lies protect the relationship when they may actually be corroding it from within. When lying is discovered, the hurt comes not just from the specific content of the lie, but from the betrayal of trust it represents, and from the questioning it provokes. If they lied about this, what else have they lied about? If I can't trust what they say, what can I trust? The discovered lie retrospectively casts doubt on everything, forcing a re-evaluation of the entire relationship. This is why the advice in couples therapy often emphasizes that it's not the mistake that destroys the relationship, but the cover-up, the lying about the mistake. Confession, facing consequences, dealing with uncomfortable truth, these are paths toward repair. Deception and discovered deception tends to create a rupture that's much harder to heal because it fundamentally damages the epistemic foundation of the relationship, the assumption that you know this person and can believe what they tell you. At the societal level, widespread lying creates systematic problems for cooperation and institutional function. When trust in institutions declines, when people believe that government officials lie routinely, that media outlets systematically distort truth, that corporations engage in deceptive practices as standard operating procedure, social coordination becomes much more difficult. Democracy requires a baseline of shared factual understanding and trust that elected officials are at least attempting to represent constituents' interests. Markets require trust that contracts will be honored, that product claims are accurate, that financial information is reliable. Science requires trust that researchers are reporting their methods and results honestly. When these forms of trust break down, everything becomes harder. Resources must be diverted to verification and enforcement that would otherwise be available for productive activity. People become cynical and disengaged, or they retreat into tribal epistemologies, where they only believe sources aligned with their group identity. We may be experiencing this breakdown now in many Western democracies. Trust in major institutions has declined significantly over recent decades. Whether this reflects an actual increase in institutional lying or simply more awareness of lying that was always present is debatable. But the consequences are real. Lower voting participation, declining faith in expertise, proliferation of conspiracy theories, and fracturing of shared informational reality. Some theorists worry we're entering a post-truth era, where the concept of objective fact is breaking down entirely, where political and social questions are decided not by evidence and argument, but by which tribal narrative is more emotionally compelling or better serves in-group identity. This is perhaps an overstated concern, but it's true that modern technology, particularly social media algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy, has created unprecedented capacity for spreading misinformation and for creating echo chambers where false beliefs are reinforced rather than corrected. There's also a personal integrity cost to lying that's harder to quantify but deeply felt by many people. When you lie, particularly about significant matters, you create a gap between your public presentation and your private reality, between who you appear to be and who you actually are. This gap can be experienced as a form of self-alienation, a sense that the person you're showing to the world is a performance or a mask rather than your authentic self. Existentialist philosophers, particularly Sartre and Heidegger, wrote about authenticity and bad faith, the ways people deceive themselves about their freedom and responsibility, creating false necessities that excuse them from choice and action. In a more everyday sense, people who lie extensively often report feeling that they don't really know themselves anymore, that they've been performing for others for so long that they've lost touch with what they actually think and feel. The maintenance of a false self requires suppressing or ignoring aspects of the true self, and over time, this can create a deep confusion about identity. Yet, despite all these costs, and despite the near universal moral condemnation of lying, there are situations where lying appears not just excusable but morally required, where honesty would be a kind of cruelty or complicity in harm. These gray areas reveal the fundamental tension between different moral principles and the impossibility of having a single simple rule about truth-telling. The pro-social lies we discussed earlier, while often trivial, reveal an important principle. Sometimes, kindness is more important than accuracy. When your friend's aging parent asks them, "Am I a burden?" the kind response is, "Of course not. We love having you here." Even if the honest response would be, "Yes, actually, this is quite difficult." The goal of the interaction is not information exchange, but emotional support and reassurance. Perfect honesty in such moments can be not just unkind, but actively harmful, inflicting pain without producing any compensating benefit. Life or death situations like hiding Jews in Nazi Germany make the moral case even more clear. In such circumstances, lying to protect innocent life is not just permissible but obligatory. A person who refused to lie to Nazis searching for hidden Jews, citing Kantian principles about the absolute duty of truth-telling, would be morally culpable in the resulting deaths. Medical contexts present particularly complex gray areas. The placebo effect is well documented. Patients given inactive treatments often show real improvement if they believe the treatment is effective. This creates a strange situation where therapeutic effectiveness may require patient deception. Modern medical ethics generally prohibits outright lies, but allows vague truths This treatment has helped other patients with your condition. Doesn't specify whether it's pharmacologically active or a placebo. End-of-life care also involves difficult questions about truth-telling. Should you always give a terminal patient a brutally honest prognosis? Or should you balance truth with hope, perhaps softening the reality to preserve quality of life in remaining time? When a dying patient is in such distress that confronting mortality directly would only compound their suffering, is it kinder to maintain hope even if that hope is false? Medical professionals navigate these situations with difficulty, trying to respect patient autonomy and the right to make informed decisions while also recognizing that different patients want different levels of information and different amounts of hope. Surprise parties offer a trivial but illuminating example of socially accepted, even celebrated deception. We lie to the guest of honor about plans. We coordinate elaborate deceptions to get them to the right place at the right time. And we consider this not only acceptable but an expression of affection. The temporary deception is justified by the joy it produces when revealed. This suggests something important about human moral intuitions. We don't actually operate on absolute principles about truth-telling, but on more contextual judgments about what serves relationships and produces good outcomes. Compliments and social niceties occupy a similar space. When someone asks, "How are you?" and you respond, "I'm fine," when you're actually quite troubled, you're not really lying in a way that feels morally significant. It's a social script, a way of acknowledging each other without demanding emotional intimacy. We understand that not every interaction requires deep honesty about inner states, that social functioning requires a certain amount of performance and restraint. All of this suggests that the real question isn't whether lying is always wrong, a question that most people intuitively answer no, despite philosophical arguments to the contrary, but rather when lying is justified and what principles should guide these judgments. Several factors seem relevant based on the cases we've examined. The stakes involved, whether the lie protects or harms others, whether there are alternatives to lying that would serve the same purpose, the likely consequences of honesty versus dishonesty, whether the person being lied to has a right to the truth, and whether the deception is temporary or permanent. High-stakes situations where lives are at risk generally justify lying if necessary to protect innocence. Lies that protect others from harm are more justifiable than lies that protect the liar from deserved consequences. Temporary deceptions that will be revealed in a positive context, like surprise parties, are less problematic than permanent deceptions that create lasting false beliefs. Lies to people who are using questions as weapons, like the murderer at the door, are more acceptable than lies to people asking in good faith. But even with these principles, judgment calls remain difficult because different principles can conflict. A white lie protects feelings but also denies someone accurate information they might want. A lie to protect a friend is loyal but also makes you complicit in deception. A lie that produces better short-term consequences might produce worse long-term consequences as truth emerges and trust is damaged. We're left with the unsatisfying but probably accurate conclusion that whether to lie in any given situation requires contextual judgment that weighs multiple factors, that there is no simple algorithm or absolute rule that can resolve all cases in advance. This requires moral maturity, the ability to recognize the relevant considerations, to accurately predict likely consequences, to understand what's really at stake, and to take responsibility for the choice rather than hiding behind rules or convenient rationalizations. As we come to the end of this long journey through the landscape of human deception, what conclusions can we draw? First, and perhaps most fundamentally, lying is not an aberration but a central feature of human nature, emerging from our evolutionary history, enabled by our cognitive architecture, developing in early childhood, practiced throughout life in various forms, present across all cultures, even if details vary. The capacity for deception is inseparable from the capacities that make us human. Language, theory of mind, strategic thinking, social intelligence. We are, in some sense, built to lie, shaped by evolution to be skilled deceivers, because deception provided adaptive advantages in the complex social environments where our ancestors lived. This is not to excuse lying or to suggest it's inevitable in every situation, but it's to acknowledge that the moral injunction to never lie fights against powerful aspects of our biology and psychology. Second, lying comes at significant costs, even when it succeeds and is never discovered. The cognitive burden of maintaining deceptions, the physiological stress, the psychological discomfort of inauthenticity, the erosion of relationships, the breakdown of social trust. All of these represent real harms that lying inflicts. The person who lies extensively is not just harming others, but harming themselves, fragmenting their sense of self, consuming mental resources that could be directed elsewhere, potentially creating a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to escape as lies compound and as the neural pathways for deception become more developed through practice. At a societal level, widespread dishonesty creates systematic problems that undermine cooperation and shared understanding, making collective action and democratic deliberation more difficult. Third, self-deception may be the most insidious and consequential form of dishonesty because it operates beneath our awareness and because it facilitates interpersonal deception while protecting us from guilt and behavioral tells. We overestimate our abilities, reconstruct our memories to flatter ourselves, rationalize our choices in ways that serve our self-image rather than accuracy, selectively expose ourselves to confirming information while avoiding challenges to our beliefs. All of this creates a distorted picture of ourselves and the world that feels like clear sight, but is actually systematic blindness. The path to greater honesty with others probably requires greater honesty with ourselves, a willingness to question our own narratives, to seek out disconfirming information, to recognize when we're rationalizing rather than reasoning. This is extraordinarily difficult and may require external help. Trusted others who can point out our self-deceptions, practices of reflection and self-examination, intellectual humility about the limits of our own self-knowledge. Fourth, the philosophical debate about lying reveals that different moral frameworks lead to different conclusions, and there may not be a single right answer that satisfies all moral intuitions. Kant's absolute prohibition on lying is admirable in its uncompromising commitment to principle, but leads to conclusions that most people find abhorrent in extreme cases. Utilitarianism's focus on consequences is pragmatic, but risks reducing all relationships to calculations of benefit and cost, and may undermine the intrinsic value of honesty. Virtue ethics' emphasis on character and wisdom seems closest to how most people actually navigate these questions in practice, but it provides less clear guidance in difficult cases and may allow too much scope for self-serving rationalization. Perhaps what we need is not choosing one framework, but rather holding the tension between them, recognizing that duty, consequences, and character all matter, that different situations may call for different emphases, that moral wisdom involves judgment rather than algorithm. Fifth, while lying is universal, the specific forms it takes, the situations where it's condemned or accepted, and the severity with which it's punished all vary significantly across cultures. This suggests that while the capacity for deception is biologically grounded, the rules around when and how it's deployed are culturally constructed. There's no single human nature when it comes to honesty, but rather a range of possible cultural configurations that shape universal capacities in different directions. Understanding this can create both humility about our own cultural assumptions about truth-telling, and also recognition that some forms of honesty-promoting culture may serve human flourishing better than others. Cultures that create conditions where people feel safe telling truth, where honesty is rewarded rather than punished, where institutions are transparent and accountable. These may enable better outcomes than cultures where lying is normalized and expected. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, for how we live our lives, the question we face is not whether to eliminate lying, which is probably impossible and might even be undesirable given the social functions that some deceptions serve, but rather how to be more conscious and intentional about when and why we lie, how to reduce the lying that harms us and others, while recognizing that some forms of tact and kindness may require deviations from strict truth-telling. This means cultivating self-awareness about our own motivations, catching ourselves in rationalizations, being honest about when we're lying for genuine pro-social reasons versus when we're lying for convenience or self-protection. It means creating relationships where truth-telling is safe, where people can be honest about their failures and struggles without being punished, where vulnerability is met with compassion rather than judgment. It means demanding honesty from institutions and leaders, while recognizing our own susceptibility to believing comforting lies. It means practicing intellectual humility, seeking out views that challenge our own, being willing to change our minds when evidence warrants it. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of humanity's most troubling and universal characteristics. We've traveled from evolutionary biology through neuroscience, developmental psychology, philosophy, cultural studies, and personal ethics, examining deception from every angle available to us. If this has given you new ways to think about honesty and dishonesty in your own life, if it's made you more aware of your own patterns of truth and falsehood, if it's helped you understand why people lie and what the costs and benefits are, then the time has been well spent. If you found value in this journey, consider subscribing to explore more of the deep questions about human nature and the paradoxes of being conscious creatures trying to navigate a complex social world. But for now, let these thoughts settle into the background. You don't have to lie to yourself about being tired. You don't have to pretend you're alert when sleep is calling. You don't have to maintain any performance or any facade. Here, in this moment, you can simply be honest about needing rest. The truth is that sometimes the most important thing is to stop thinking, stop analyzing, stop holding yourself to any standard, and simply allow yourself to drift toward unconsciousness. The paradoxes of truth and deception will still be there tomorrow if you want to think about them again. But right now, they can fade into the distance. As your mind settles into quieter rhythms, you're safe to sleep. You're free to let go. The questions about when we should lie and when we should tell the truth, they're important questions, but they're not questions you need to answer tonight. Tonight, the only truth that matters is that you're tired, and tired people need sleep, and sleep is exactly what's available to you now. Rest well, let go, good night.